A single sheet of paper arrived like a small accusation, soaked at the edges as if it had crossed a storm to find the protagonist. The first line was short and impossible to ignore. You need to see what you left behind. Before the story begins, tell us in the comments which city you are watching from, and then stay until the end to rate this story. He had built a life that measured itself in numbers and meetings and a pulse of concrete. She had planted hers in soil and morning light, where dust and rain kept time. Between them, the sheet of paper threatened a truth that could lay waste to more than a bank account. Imagine the farm gate opening to a man the town had only seen in glossy photographs and heard about in stories of inheritance and company takeovers. Imagine the oven heat of summer meeting the cool metal of a luxury car door. The stakes were more than property. The stakes were memory and a child who might be the hinge of both. He arrived in the evening as the sky bruised with rain. The gravel under his shoes gave out a thin metallic sound, and the smell of wet hay wrapped him like a foreign language. He held the note so that the ink had smeared into a soft halo where a raindrop had fallen. From the lane, the farmhouse appeared softer than images he had bought and sold in boardrooms. From the window, a figure moved, small and precise, hands lifting to push hair from a face. The protagonist stepped forward with a wallet full of papers and a head full of plans. He had been a millionaire for 7 years and had sworn never to return. The arrival of that note was the incident that would break his oath. "I did not expect this," he said, voice not yet steady. "Then why did you come?" came the reply, calm as the skin of an apple. The first scene closed with a child's shadow passing across the curtained window, and the protagonist feeling a pull that was not about money, but about something he had tried to bury. The day after the note, the farm smelled of coffee and fresh earth. The protagonist waited at the gate while a woman in work gloves measured out seed by weight and memory. He had rehearsed words in cars and hotels, words that felt accurate there and blunt here. "You left without a word?" he began. "I left so you could have a future," she answered. The conversation tightened. She set a basket of potatoes between them, and the thin skin of one split under her thumb, releasing a sweet, loamy scent. Around them, neighbors passed the news like a tray, soft and deliberate. The first human reaction came in the form of a child stepping out from behind the house, eyes not yet literate in suspicion and hope. "Who is that man?" the child asked, voice small against the wide sky. The woman looked at the child and then at the protagonist, feeling the gravity of what had been sent in that note. People in the town had names and opinions and pockets of memory that never fully closed. The community watched with a combination of curiosity and protective ritual. "Do you have proof?" asked a woman named Paula, who ran the market stall and who had seen enough to know how family secrets bent into public stories. "Proof will come," the protagonist said. "I do not want to drag anyone into old mistakes," she replied, hands busy wiping soil from her palms. The second scene widened. At the market, the smell of spices mingled with hooves and tires, and the sound of children running a foot race between stalls. The protagonist walked among rows where produce was stacked like small altars to patience. He spoke with Louise, a tractor hands man, who had once helped with a harvest and who ran a feed store. "You are back," Louise said, voice like gravel. "You are wealth wrapped in a car," Marta, who kept the bakery oven hot, added with a dry smile. He answered each with care, leaning into the texture of the town, feeling the ruff of wool against his expensive coat and the soft give of bread under his palms. The child who had appeared by the house lingered at the edge of the market, eyes absorbing faces, noting patterns. The protagonist watched the child with a mix of fear and something like longing. At the end of the day, the protagonist and the woman who had kept the farm traded lines that were small and fatal. "Why now?" he asked. "Because the bank has a file, and the letter came," she said. "Because the law is a thing that can come like harvest," he answered. A note of threat began to take shape, not yet loud, but present, like thunder on a horizon. The small exchanges in the market set the scene for public stakes. The protagonist left with a promise to return, and the woman returned to close the oven and listen to the rain. Between the arrival and the confrontation, the protagonist started watching. He hired an investigator for small things at first, a legal node firm in the city that did background checks and property searches. The investigator's name was Daniel. Daniel carried a camera and a pen and moved with an efficiency that smelled of new coffee. He found papers that smelled of dust and old ink in a bank box the farm had long ago opened to keep receipts for a debt that should have been paid. The protagonist sat in a rented room smelling faintly of bleach and thought about the way his life had been traded like a ledger entry. He reread the note and wondered who had sent it and why. "Someone wanted this found," he said to Daniel, "or someone wanted you found." Daniel replied, "The farm had a heart in the community, a circle of helpers who would not let the place be swallowed without a fight. Claire, the nurse from the clinic, came by to check on the child. Henry, the volunteer firefighter, tightened a tarp over a stack of hay. Sheriff Allen made a round to keep the peace. Each of them performed small services that built a mosaic of support around the woman and the land. The protagonist felt smaller than he had in years. He was used to power and suits and city lights. Out here, the power was in hands calloused by work and faces lined with seasons. The contrast only amplified the threat, not just from a bank, but from a corporate structure that had ways to bend law to ledger. It did not take long to find a thread that pointed to a larger plan. Papers found in the bank box were stamped with names that matched a firm that had grown like ivy around smaller properties in the county. The firm had been buying up debts, foreclosing quietly, then flipping land to developers who had never seen the place in fog or rain. An executive named Marcus Gray was the face of a holding company that had been buying up small farms and smoothing the fences out of sight. Marcus had a polished voice and the smell of lemon oil from his car interior. The protagonist read a contract that contained clauses written to trap the unwary and to make the auction a certainty. They found a note from a lawyer at a bank that suggested an impending sale, an auction date stamped in red ink, and a list of debts the farm could not meet. The protagonist felt trapped between regret and the mechanical certainty of corporate documents. He decided to act. He would not be the man who had only taken. He would step into the muddy boots of those he had once hurt. "We need evidence beyond the paper," he told Daniel. "We need a witness to every transaction, an expert who can say the clauses were predatory." Marta volunteered to gather receipts and neighbors to testify about a history of payments. Paula drove to the county seat to look for official stamps. Claire collected medical receipts that proved the child had been on the farm and not a short-term tenant. Each contribution felt like a stitch being pulled through a torn coat. They found emails that showed the company had applied pressure to a bank officer to accelerate the claim. The pattern suggested not a simple foreclosure, but a deliberate extraction. The protagonist began to assemble an alliance. He brought money to hire an independent expert, an appraiser named Elena who smelled of paper and old campuses. Elena walked the fields, ran her hands over fence posts, and listened to the creak of the barn. She spoke of value beyond numbers. Land holds labor and story and seed and furrow. "The smell of rain," she said. "You cannot reduce that to a balance sheet without erasing lives." Elena's testimony became the hinge for the legal line of defense they would build. In town, there were late-night meetings in a church hall where coffee cooled and hands wrote lists under a single lamp. The antagonist, the corporate executive Marcus Smith, was portrayed in district headlines as an efficient businessman. The protagonist knew him as a figure who smiled with polished teeth and whose assistants whispered about growth and investor returns. The farm, he threatened, was a place where the oven in the kitchen heated bread and where fingerprints in flour told stories that no bank ledger could. In one extended conversation in the church hall, the protagonist explained his motives, not for his own conscience, but for the child who watched and for the woman who had held the farm together.
"I left because I was afraid to be tied down by wrong ties," he said. "Now I see what ties can also protect," she answered. The alliance became a community act and a legal strategy, and, for the protagonist, a process of redemption through work, not words. Weeks into their effort, the danger escalated. On a night when rain came in sheets and the road turned to a river of mud, a fire started in the barn. The heat rose like an accusation, and the farm was drenched in orange light under a gray sky. The protagonist woke to smoke in his nose and the sound of the child coughing. The scene moved into action and rescue. "Get the child," the protagonist shouted, and felt the world narrow to a single line of action. "I am going into the barn," Henry said, slinging a rope around his shoulder. The barn door was hot to the touch, and the smell of burning straw was sharp and immediate. Luke, the farmer next door, lunged with a shovel, and Marta filled buckets that steamed under the rain like ritual. The list of names grew longer, and the dialogue between them became a rhythm of urgency. "We will lose the harvest," one cried. "We will lose more than the harvest," another countered. The child was pulled from the smoke with hands black and trembling. At the hospital, a thin fluorescent light hummed while monitors printed quiet lines. The protagonist sat with the child wrapped in a blanket that smelled of antiseptic and shampoo. "Is she all right?" he asked. "She will be," Claire said, voice steady but tired. The confession came not in verse but in pieces. A neighbor named Marta had seen a stranger on the edge of the property the week before, a van with a logo not local. "It was Marcus Agents," she said. In the hush of the hospital room, the protagonist felt the truth arrive with a weight he had not expected. It was not only a legal fight, it was something that could destroy him emotionally if the whole truth came out. He had a past that was not clean. He had wronged people before he had learned how to make amends. This was one of the moments of maximum tension. The fire, the hospital, the fear of the child being hurt, the possibility that his return would not save the farm, but instead drag the full length of his baggage into the light. The scene slowed so you could hear breaths, the beeping of machines, the drip of a faucet, the rustle of sheets. The protagonist looked through the window and watched rain wash the parking lot and a bank logo glow faintly like a distant lighthouse. He remembered a promise he had made somewhere between a courtroom and a corporate retreat, the promise to never let greed be his compass again. He thought about the small hands wrapped in that hospital blanket, and of a child who might be his kin, and the possibility that saying yes would mean he had to accept the cost. The tension here was not explosive, but dense. What did redemption require? Would he sign away his clean slate and his city comforts to protect a farm and admit to failings that would destroy his image and maybe his company? Questions piled. Could he sacrifice the $1 million and his reputation for what was right? Would the town accept him if he asked for forgiveness? The answer would require truth. The investigation and community pressure found an opening. The protagonist had opened lines with a lawyer named Rachel who worked pro bono for cases that involved malfeasance. The legal work was procedural and technical, but it was also a public exercise. She prepared documents and filings and scheduled a hearing at which the bank and the corporate firm would need to justify their actions. The legal description of events showed attention to procedure. The filing detailed chain of title anomalies, unexplained acceleration of debt, and irregular communications between a bank officer and corporate counsel. Each element was supported by sworn affidavits and original receipts. The procedural description was crisp. Evidence handling had been cataloged with date and timestamps, each document photographed 3 times, and witnesses sworn before a clerk. The audit trail would be presented to a judge who had the authority to issue an injunction and halt any auction. The protagonist watched as legal steps moved like bones under flesh and felt both relief and terror. Marcus sent a note, thin and polite, trying to offer a settlement that smelled of Beale and erasure. "We prefer to resolve outside of court," his representative wrote. The protagonist thought of the child, of the oven baking bread in the morning, and of a town that did not belong in a spreadsheet. He refused. The public confrontation was set in a small courtroom where wood smelled of older arguments and the heat held the residue of many anxieties. The courtroom filled with neighbors and reporters. Paula and Louise and Marta, Claire and Henry and Daniel and Elena all came. Sheriff Allen sat in the back. Marcus arrived with a lawyer from the city who wore a suit that seemed to cut angles into the room. The protagonist took a breath and spoke not from a script, but from a place he had learned to open. "This land is not only soil," he said to the judge. "It is a ledger of lives." Elena testified about the appraisal and value based on stewardship, not only square footage. Daniel presented photographs that showed how clauses had been applied selectively. Rachel laid out the legal violations with a cadence that made each point clear and damaging. Marcus's counsel tried to pivot to the efficiency of market procedure, claiming foreclosure was routine. But the community testimony and the technical evidence made the foreclosure look malicious and opportunistic. The judge issued an injunction halting the auction and ordered a forensic audit. The public exposure of the corporate scheme eroded the polished veneer Marcus had. His company faced fines and a review by regulatory authorities. A reporter asked the protagonist in the hall how he had turned from the city to this work. He answered with a sentence that felt like a handing over. "I came here to fix what I broke and to be known for more than numbers." The legal victory did not erase other truths. In the quiet that followed the courtroom drama, the protagonist and the woman sat under the eaves while rain tapped the roof in a soft percussion. They had a conversation in which the backstory that had pushed them apart returned in detail. He told her about his childhood, about a father who taught the value of accumulation over affection, about being pulled by city lights and the seduction of rapid success. He told her about leaving and thinking absence would mean safety. She told him about nights with no money, about standing in a bank line and being told that there was a date on a sheet when the world would be taken. The backstory showed 4 arcs in compact form: his childhood of scarcity, a scholarship that took him to the city and the contract world, a formative loss, the death of his mother that made him retreat into work, and a present in which he realized that wealth had been a shield, not an answer. Each paragraph of memory connected to the present battle, the way roots connected to the surface. He apologized and took responsibility, and offered not only money but labor, not only words but plans to work the land to learn its seasons. "I cannot undo the years I was gone," he said, "but I can be present for the years to come." She listened, and at times a laugh escaped that was equal parts grief and relief. The dialogue here was long and intimate and necessary. It was the emotional fulcrum that allowed him to move from being a man fleeing guilt to one who would accept the slow, honest work of repair. The fall of the antagonist unfolded in the press and in a regulatory report. Marcus's firm had misapplied clauses in contracts and had coordinated with a bank officer to accelerate foreclosures in towns where land was undervalued. The forensic report documented inappropriate emails and directives and indexed transactions that appeared to incentivize quick turnovers for profit. The company's stock dipped, and investors demanded accountability. Marcus resigned from his executive role, and the firm agreed to a settlement that included restoration of some properties and a fund for affected families. It was civic justice of a kind that can rarely be scheduled but arrives when enough people speak and documents exist. The protagonist and the woman stood on the porch while a truck with a logo for a small agricultural cooperative unloaded supplies. The town gathered. The auction that had threatened the farm was canceled officially, and the title cloud began to clear. The protagonist had used his resources not to buy silence, but to fund legal challenges and to make public the harm caused by predatory practices. "We do not want pity," Paula said at a meeting. "We want fairness and the right to keep what we have worked for." The community applauded. The small victory felt large enough to breathe in. In the weeks that followed, the child learned the names of people who would be constants. Claire checked on health. Elena helped design a small kitchen garden. Daniel fixed a broken window, and Henry checked the barn beams. Each person was a stitch. The protagonist was now not only an investor, but a learner. He rose before dawn to help with harvest and learned the smell of soil after rain and the sound of a rooster that no city alarm clock could mimic. He and the woman argued and made peace and argued again. They grew into a rhythm that had no spreadsheet, but that had daily proofs of commitment: a repaired fence, a paid bill, a shared plate. The community that had first watched with suspicion began to accept the idea that people can change through right action and steady presence. At this point, we pause to ask you a question, and we really want to hear from you. If someone from your past returned to your life with a single note asking you to see what was left behind, how would you react? Type the city you are watching from and then write one word that best describes your choice: forgive, or ignore, or confront. Your comment helps others see different ways to handle heavy returns and shows us what stories you want to see next. It builds this community and guides the kinds of investigations and moments we bring to the channel. Thank you for sharing, and now let us return to the story, because what happens next reshapes them all. Months later, the farm had repairs and a letter from a lawyer confirming the injunction and a plan for long-term security. The protagonist had agreed to fund a community fund and to sit on a local board to manage the cooperative that would buy produce. In a small act of ceremony, he and the woman planted a tree together in the field, a fruit tree that would take seasons to feed people. It was a symbol, not of instant solution, but of slow promise. The town threw a small harvest fair, where stalls sold pies and preserves, and the bank that had once pushed the claim donated a scholarship fund as part of the settlement, an awkward but necessary public contrition. The protagonist stood in a crowd that smelled of sugar and hay. He watched the child run between legs and felt a softness in his chest he had not anticipated. There were several moments that required specific procedural description for those who followed the legal arc. The audit of the foreclosure process required a forensic review of communications between bank officials and corporate counsel. Each email was captured with metadata, showing IP addresses, timestamps, and retention headers. An expert certified a chain of custody for physical documents, receipts were logged with serial numbers and witness signatures, and all filings were submitted under seal to the county clerk and timestamped for record. The judge ordered a temporary restraining order while the audit completed, and affidavits from local witnesses were taken under oath with a notary public present, making the testimony admissible. This technical sequence was brief but critical to the legal reversal because it proved irregularities in process and established standing for the injunction. In the months after the legal exposure, Marcus faced personal repercussions. His company underwent regulatory scrutiny, and his name became a case study cited by a regional paper. Some people felt vindictive and wanted to see him ruined. The protagonist refused a private settlement that would have erased accountability, and instead asked for structured reparations to affected farms. He had to negotiate in public ways and to accept that truth sometimes demands uncomfortable visibility. The community did not ask for personal humiliation. They asked for repair. The protagonist learned the distinction and lived by it. 3 long scenes of tension had to be slowed and felt. The first was the night of the barn fire, where the protagonist moved from bystander to rescuer and where the child's cough became the central sound that would not be ignored. The second was the courtroom hearing, where a judge's gavel sat between a set of documents and the lives that would be decided by words and witnesses. The third was the meeting where Marcus offered a settlement that would buy silence and where the protagonist chose transparency instead. Each slowed sequence included small sensory details: the warmth of a blanket in a fluorescent-lit hospital, the squeak of shoes on courtroom floor, the bitter taste of coffee at midnight while neighbors wrote witness statements. These moments were not fast action, but
Felt like a slow boil moving toward accountability. The ending moved toward reconciliation, not as a tidy closure, but as a process visible in gestures. The protagonist asked if they could try to make a life together in a way that acknowledged the past and did not erase it. "Can we be partners in this work, not just in the court documents, but in the mourning work?" he asked. "Can you accept me knowing I was not perfect?" he said. "Can you trust that actions will speak?" she replied. They did not marry in a church with fanfare. They agreed to a union that began with a shared ledger of chores and a promise to attend town meetings together. The community celebrated with a potluck. People named in the process, Paula, Louise, Marta, Daniel, Claire, Henry, Alana, Sheriff Allen, all hugged and shared pies. There was a small ceremony where the child placed the first ribbon on the fruit tree they had planted. Epilogue. 1 month later. The tree had new shoots, and the protagonist had left the city apartment and now rented a room above the feed store. The farm had an emergency plan by the community, and the cooperative had signed its first contract to sell organic produce to a local restaurant. The protagonist wrote to investors explaining his shift in priorities and set up a trust to help other small farms avoid predatory auctions. People in town began to trust the idea that change need not erase accountability but could begin with it. Epilogue. 3 months later. The child was enrolled in school, and the protagonist had a small board seat with the cooperative that required him to learn about irrigation and soil tests. The village market saw more visitors, and the oven at the bakery produced more loaves. The bank that had once pushed the agenda now sat with community members to understand loan terms better. Marcus's company had implemented new compliance measures after regulators scrutinized its practices. The protagonist offered to fund financial literacy classes in the community as reparative action. Epilogue. 6 months later. Harvest saw the community working together and the protagonist standing in a field that smelled of cut grass and late sun. The farm had a ceremonial sign that read the name of the family who had kept it, and a plaque noting the community fund that supported other smallholders. The protagonist had become a figure who mixed city knowledge and farm patience, who could write proposals at night and mend a fence at dawn. He had learned to measure success not only by capital returns, but by the laughter of neighbors and the health of a child whose smile had first pushed him back through the gate. The legal chapter had closed with an order for restitution, and the auction had been permanently canceled. The town had weathered the storm of exposure and come out with a tighter net of mutual aid. The oven kept baking, and the harvest returned.
To table. If this story moved you, rate it from 0 to 10 in the comments and tell us what word best describes your reaction: forgive, or ignore, or confront. If you want more stories where justice meets human repair, subscribe and become part of a community that chooses to listen and act. This is a story about letters and farms and dust and rain, about bank ledgers and ovens and harvests, and about how a single note can reopen a past, and how the right kind of response can mend more than property. In the end, what remained was not the amount in a bank account, but the faces that gathered to tend the land, to feed each other, and to claim a new everyday life. Because some promises are not made with signatures alone, but with the steady work of hands that sow and water and wait for fruit.